My name's Jo Littler. I'm part of the Soundings editorial board. Welcome to the second event based on Neoliberalism, the Kilburn Manifesto. This has been put together by the founding editors of Soundings, Stuart Hall, Doreen Massey and Mike Rustin, to help debate and create alternatives to neoliberal culture. The manifesto is being released in a series of instalments, so this is the second instalment. The first one was very animated. If you came to it, it was at King's, and it's freely available on YouTube if you want to have a look at what happened. The second one is tonight, and the third one will be in the autumn on relational welfare, so keep an eye out for that. We're going to release more details about that later on the Lawrence and Wishart email list. But tonight we're going to be debating the second instalment, which is called Vocabularies of the Economy, on how neoliberalism has become normalised in everyday language. And this is written by Doreen Massey. Doreen is Professor of Geography at the Open University. She's very well known for her work on globalisation and uneven power geometries. And her many books include World, City and For Space. We're going to start off with Doreen discussing her work, and then we're going to move on to Emma Dowling, who's going to be offering some comments in response. Emma is lecturer in sociology at Middlesex University, and she writes on political economy and effective labour. She's written some really interesting pieces on waitressing in particular. She's also guest edited issues of the online journals Ephemera and Lateral. And then after that we'll open it up for questions to the floor, so I imagine we'll have a bit more time for questions because unfortunately Heather Wakefield couldn't make it because she's sick. So I just wanted to remind you to switch off your mobile phones, and then I will turn over to Doreen.
Mobile phone may still be on, never mind. Welcome, it's nice to see everybody here. First of all, can I say, we are all collectively very sorry that you only got sight of this so recently. I mean, there were various shenanigans. This is our first kind of post-framing statement instalment, and the complexities of coordinating a commentary with The Guardian and a whole host of other things meant that we couldn't actually put it online until much later than we'd wanted to. So, very sorry, and for that reason I will not assume that you have read every jot and tittle of my writing, and we'll go through it out in a very, very broad way so that at least we have a common basis for discussion. As a lot of you will know, the way we tried to argue in the framing statement, after neoliberalism, the opening statement of the Kilburn Manifesto, was to think of neoliberalism as the term we use to describe the social settlement that's dominated the UK for the last 30, unfortunately getting on now for 40 years, in which the terms of neoliberalism, and I mean by that more than the economic, but the terms of neoliberalism have become hegemonic. And crucial to that way of understanding the world is a notion of common sense. And by common sense, what we were trying to get at is those things that we forget to question, those things that are so taken for granted that they are not subject anymore to political contestation. In the media, often even in our own heads, and in political debate more widely. So that notion of common sense is crucial to the way in which we want to think about the Kilburn Manifesto in general. That's what our argument is. We've got to challenge that common sense. It's absolutely futile to keep on arguing within the terms of the current common sense. That will lead only to being defensive and arguing, if you like, on their political terrain. We've got to, it is busting open that common sense, we think, that will enable us to establish our own political terrain and seriously to challenge then the terms on which neoliberalism is established. So that's why we've begun with an instalment which is very much around common sense and is around common sense in one of the centerpieces of the neoliberal hegemony, which is, of course, the economy. And that notion of common sense is something that is not just the terms that we use. What we're trying to argue in this is that it's a common sense that moulds our self-understanding. It moulds our imaginations. It moulds the way in which we conceive of the relations we have with other people. It moulds the way in which implicitly, without even thinking about it, we imagine the shape of society and the way in which it works. And our broad arguments, I guess, are firstly that these common senses take work to establish. They appear to be natural, but actually they're the product of long decades of political work to establish them. And for that very reason, they change and can be challenged. As indeed the neoliberal hegemony that we are suffering under now, challenged to the point of pretty much extinction the social democratic common sense that lasted from the late 40s to the late 70s. Completely overturned things I used to think were obvious, like public was good and all kinds of things like that, are now completely overturned. That took work. People now think that is natural, that it always was so, and of course it is such. But it took work to make that change. And we need now to take advantage of the moment of economic crisis, I think, to challenge the ideological and political common sense upon which the neoliberal economy rests. So that's what we're on about. And I begin the little thing that I wrote with one very obvious relation or piece of terminology that lots and lots of people completely unpolitical, find very irritating. And that is the way in which we are so often just categorised as customers. You know, whether it's on the train, in the hospital, as a student in a university, we are called customers. And if we're, say, a teacher in a university, asked to conceptualise our students as customers, as clients. And that's a terminology that if you use it often enough, you repeat it often enough, you gradually imbibe it, moulds our identities. Yes? It tells us what we are, in a sense. And it characterises our relationships to other people as commercial transactions. And that means that it erases the specificity of the real relations that are going on. It's not that I'm a student learning from a teacher. It's not that I'm a patient being treated by a nurse or a doctor. All the specificity of those real processes, those real relationships, gets obscured by the one overriding relationship, which is that we buy and we sell. And we are overwhelmingly in the society customers. So I open that's why it really struck me. I opened the little instalment with this visit to an art gallery here in London. I had this really smashing conversation with this young woman about the art in the show. And as she turned to leave and I saw on her back customer liaison, I really did feel deflated. And I mean, it didn't eradicate the authenticity of the conversation. I'm sure she meant it as much as I did, but somehow socially it was being characterised as something instrumental, as something commercial, as something about a buyer and a seller, a customer and a provider. And so my kind of real deep enjoyment of the conversation was kind of flattened by that categorisation of it. That doesn't mean it wasn't real, and in some ways maybe by talking for so long we were going beyond the bounds of her duty as customer liaison. She was probably only allowed 3.5 minutes per customer, but we spent a lot longer. Anyway, so that's the little example with which I start, and which is very much about our personal identities. But in the rest of the paper, I've tried to take on some of the ways in which we imagine the economy more broadly, and the way in which it's talked about. I'm here thinking of anything from newspapers, including liberal newspapers, all the radio stations that I listen to anyway, and a lot of just popular discourse, just popular conversation, and the terminology and the assumptions that are used in those kinds of fora, which, first of all, obviously affect how we imagine economy. But they also, and this what is crucial from a more immediately political point of view, they restrict the range of policies that you can discuss within economic debate, right? They already close down the field. They, in a sense, restrict what is thinkable when you're having a discussion about the economy. Now, there's quite a lot in the paper that's quite detailed, and it's about some of the theoretical background to some of these arguments. I'm not going to mention any of that. Please, if you haven't had time to read it, do. I'm just going to mention some examples to get us going. Think, for instance, one that really annoys me is that set of concepts: investment, expenditure, and speculation. I mean, first of all, they all come trailing, in Wordsworthian words, they all come trailing moral connotations, right? Investment sounds good. It's doing something now, foregoing even, in order to be better in the future in some way or other. Expenditure, well, it's just an outgoing. It's a cost, it's a burden. And speculation, definitely, if you're talking about finance, definitely sounds dodgy, right? So the use of this terminology brings with it already a kind of emotional atmosphere. So let's think how we use them in popular and political discourse when we're talking about the economy. Imagine a classic interview on the BBC or something like that. Take first the couple investment/expenditure. In the national accounts, formally speaking, investment is defined as money laid out for long-term things such as buildings and infrastructure. Yeah? Whereas expenditure is money laid out for instance, payment of the wages of the people that are going to work in that infrastructure, in those buildings. The people operating the services which the investment will provide the infrastructure for. So, obvious example, building a new school is investment, moral connotation, a good thing to do. Paying teachers, administrators and dinner ladies who work in that school is expenditure. Moral overtone, this is a cost, this is potentially a burden. And at one point, I just put in brackets in the paper, but I really meant it, is just think of the gender implications that usually go along with that kind of distinction. Now that formal distinction, which itself, as I say, brings these intuitive understandings of what we're talking about, is often cross-cut in popular political discussion by another one, which is that between public and private and public. So money advanced by a private company for investment in its profit-making activities is seen as a worthwhile investment, whatever it is. But money advanced by the state for whatever is seen as a cost because it will only increase, and we're talking about now, will only increase the deficit. Can we afford to do that? And together, if you cross-cut those two distinctions, it's absolutely devastating for employment in public services, because on both counts, employment as a dinner lady or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor comes out as expenditure. And that's where I am really, one of the reasons, I'll come to another later, I'm so very disappointed not to have Heather here. And if there are other people here from Unison, I think this is a really important point that trades unions ought to be picking up on and hammering home. But if we thought about the economy in a different way, if we had a different imagination of the economy, if we imagine the economy as part of the social one element in a wider process of the social reproduction of society as a whole, then surely education and health could be seen as precisely, all of them, long-term investments for the improvement of the future of society. And one theme, a question that runs through the whole paper is one that I just think we should, if you ever get interviewed by anybody in any of these contexts, we should just ask back, to say. What is an economy for? You know, what is it we want to get out of an economy? What do we want it to provide? What should be the relationship between economy and society? And that is so very, very rarely asked. And yet when you start to disentangle how we use those terms, it rises very clearly as a question to the surface. Then there's that couple, investment speculation. And I think while the previous couple, investment expenditure, is one that we want to disturb and start questioning, because I think the way in which it works at the moment does a lot of political damage. The distinction between investment and speculation is one I think we ought to be going to town on to insist on making, because it isn't usually made. Everything gets counted as investment. So money that is put into a productive activity, for whatever purposes, counts as investment. Fine, that is investment. It's investment in a process of the creation of wealth. Stopping for a moment without defining what we mean by wealth. But that is, in general terms, investment in a productive activity. But what about money which is put into buying an already existing asset? Could be diamonds, could be grain, could be commodity futures. And the reason you buy them is not for any kind of production process at all, but merely to sell them on, you hope, at a higher price at a later date. Now, in general parlance, and especially when the people being interviewed are from the city, and I think actually fairly generally now, that is also called investment. Yeah? And yet there is no value creation in it at all. In fact, it's speculation. All it involves is value extraction. It's precisely just buying and selling, just what we talked about at the very beginning of what I was saying. What it does is redistributes value to those who have managed to buy the assets and sell them on at a profit. So it's a redistributive measure of the already existing pool of value. And that's massively important right now under neoliberalism in its pomp as well as subsequent to its crash. Because much of what lies behind that 4 decades of neoliberalism and its actually fairly modest levels of so-called growth anyway, is a process not of value creation, but of value extraction. An awful lot of neoliberal economic activity has been the buying and selling of already existing things. Wine, commodities, property, land, derivatives, carbon futures, things that have been either created to be just assets or already existing assets. And that has meant a massive redistribution of wealth in that general sense towards those who could afford to buy or to those who already existing owners of assets. And that real huge shift, that's what lies behind financialisation to a large extent. And that huge shift in the balance of the way the economy works is one of the things that lies behind the massive rise in inequality that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. Not just within this country, but globally too. It's one of the things, I mean, read the reports of the World Development Movement and so forth. It's one, speculation in food, already, grain futures, stuff like that, is one of the things that lies behind malnutrition and food shortages, massively rising food prices around the world. Right, that is not growth, that is redistribution from hungry people to people who buy and sell futures in food. It's also one of the things that lies behind the peak of our own economy here, and we really should be much more critical of it, and that is the new financial imperialism of the City of London. When they talk about the city as a centre of wealth creation, I mean, undoubtedly some goes on there, but actually it's a mechanism for the redistribution of wealth through the production of new commodities, new assets, if you like, and the buying and selling of existing ones. This is serious, right? If we're going seriously to take on the financial sector, then we need to insist, I think, on this distinction. And I quote very briefly in the paper a little bit from Mariana Mazzucato.
Oh, good, yeah.
Yeah. And she's a real expert in this. I'm not, but she's read it. What I say is okay. She's passed it. I got a tick.
Yeah.
And I do. And she argues, I think it's in the quote that I use, that if we're going to address financialisation and the power of the financial elite, which is not just economic, it's precisely about the way we think, about how we conceptualise ourselves, how we think about an economy, then we have to insist on making very clearly this distinction between investment and speculation and pointing out the social and political implications of the distinction and who is doing what. I haven't put this here, but I will just say it, and that is, this is tricky because, especially sitting here in London and in the southeast of England, because an awful lot of people in these parts made more money last year and the year before, and certainly over the last 30 years, made it in a kind of virtual way from increases in the price of their house than they did in, or buying and selling houses indeed, than they did from their jobs. And so this is, it means it's a tricky question to address politically because it affects strata who aren't simply the enemy. It also means that we have all been enrolled into this mode of economic behaviour, which is about getting money not from doing productive jobs, but simply thinking about buying and selling. So it's in that way, both materially and imaginatively, we're enrolled into thinking that this is fair dues, you know, I bought it and they built a new railway station right by and my house went up by £100,000. You did nothing, you know. So it's a tricky one politically, but I still think we absolutely need to insist upon it. This is not casual terminology. This kind of terminology really matters politically. And there's a whole host of words that we could, I think, just get a lot more tough about. One of the ones that most annoys me, and just 2 seconds on this, just because it gets my goat, and that is taxation. It is a truth universally believed in. I will not quote Jane Austen precisely because it doesn't quite fit, but the taxation is absolutely horrible. The taxman, you know, blah, 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 all that stuff. We all hate paying taxes, don't we? But what's at issue here is our collective responsibilities for certain aspects of the social reproduction of society. Taxation, people quite happily pay through the nose for all kinds of things in the private sector and don't moan about it. But ask them to pay a slightly higher tax. And it's not just because it's for Trident or something. We can argue about how tax is spent. But tax in itself is seen as peculiarly horrible. A price we do not want to pay. Everybody hates paying it. But what's at issue is social solidarity. What's at issue in the end is our collective contribution to the reproduction of society. And if we thought of it like that, maybe we'd have a bigger right to have a say in how the taxes were spent, because we'd be thinking of it precisely in those terms. And I just wonder if anybody, certainly, you know, any big political figure, has the political nerve to argue that taxation is good. I would like to see somebody try it, to take that on and argue back and argue the case for collectivity and the social. And the last example I want to mention here, because it's one I deal with in some depth in the paper, and I think it's obviously crucial, is the overwhelming agreement that what we need in an economy is growth. Growth is seen without doubt as positive. It's one of those words that's the connotations are positive in all normal political economic discourse. And that's not only true the right or of neoliberalism, it has been true, well, in my living memory, which is quite long, Certainly a lot longer than neoliberalism. It was true under social democracy, it is true for those social democrats that are currently contesting logic, contesting neoliberalism. The assumption is that the economy is about something called wealth creation, and we must see that grow. And the social democratic argument, of course, is that we need growth in order to be able to redistribute to make society more equal. Well, Michael's here, Stuart isn't, but I think it's fair to say that the Kilburn Manifesto gang, as a whole, wants at least to question that assumption. And this, again, I'm really sorry that Heather's not here, because I think this is a huge issue for trades unionism that we need to do a lot of talking about. And I think I've got 6 reasons why we should question the easy assumption that growth is a terribly positive thing, a positively positive thing, and you can probably think of more. Firstly, I mean, just quite simply, in the foreseeable future, it's probable that we will not have sufficient levels of growth to enable the kinds of redistribution that people, I assume like us, but vaguely progressive people, would want to see to correct the vast inequalities that we have in society at the moment. So there's a kind of technical problem there. Secondly, that whole social democratic notion in modified form under neoliberalism is a very bizarre arrangement anyway. I mean, first you let the economy rip, you produce inequality, and then you do something in order to try and solve it. First produce a problem, and then scratch your head and try and think, how are we going to solve this? Oh, we'll redistribute some of it. I mean, why produce inequality in the first place? Obviously, different economic models have different implications for equality and inequality. Go back to Harold Wilson's, it's almost like Nirvana now, that last time we were here, we were discussing the May Day Manifesto, and of course people were very angry. But that was a model that did not produce the levels of inequality that the current model of the economy is producing. The one we have at the moment is massively productive of inequality. So we need to think of a way of having an economy, whether growing or not, that doesn't produce inequality in the first place. And that's where I have to say, and I say this in the paper, although the word alarms me, I think the notion of pre-distribution is right. What they're saying is we don't want to have an economy and then have a post hoc redistribution. We want an economy that doesn't produce that level of inequality in the first place. What would an economy look like that didn't need such vast degrees of redistribution subsequent to its operation? Okay, reason 3. Even under a very good and a very redistributive social democratic model, the terms of political struggle are very restrained. They become precisely about distribution, I think. There is no questioning within the way in which the model is set up of market forces themselves. You let market forces do their thing, and then you redistribute it. But you don't question market relations in themselves. You don't question capitalism. And that leads to point 4, which in a sense is, for me, is the historical clincher, which is that capital will only anyway let redistribution go so far. We argued in the framing statement of the manifesto that that normal story of social democracy ran into the buffers and neoliberalism, and Margaret Thatcher came in on angelic wings and saved us from the troubles. We argued in very complex ways that that's not the real story, but one of the crucial elements in it not being the real story is that social democracy was actively undermined because workers had gained too much. The share of labour had gone up too much in relation to the share of capital. In other words, there are limits to the levels of redistribution that model of first grow and then redistribute will be allowed politically. Fifthly, and massively, and I devote a little space to this in the paper. There are obvious ecological and planetary reasons why we cannot all carry on growing in the way in which we define growth and wealth at the moment. The climate change and resource exhaustion reasons. And I think here the geography of it is extraordinary. I mean, it is the global north that must take responsibility for this. To a large extent, it's not just manufacturing that we have decentralized to the global south, but pollution production. So, you know, we think of ourselves as being green, but actually it's just because we import everything from China or whatever in a very simplified form. We also export the toxic waste we do produce to countries that are so poor that they will take it and process it for us. And countries in the global south will suffer far more, have less resources to address the problems of climate change and resource depletion. And not everybody could live as do currently the rich in the United States of America. I think just to be responsible global economy means that we have to question our own model of economy needing growth. Just to be a responsible economy. Get rid of the city as well as loads of other things, but centrally there is that. And finally, of course, which might make the number 5 seem a little more palatable, wealth and growth, certainly in the way in which we define them and measure them now, in purely monetary terms, seem from all the evidence not even to be making us happier. They may be making us better off in some way that keeps being talked about, but that doesn't seem to be contributing to well-being or to something called happiness or satisfaction or whatever. So there's no point in it anyway. We just keep on running to find something that ain't there. So the question I guess we want to ask is, can we use this economic crisis to rethink the way we think about the economy? Can we challenge this dominant language and imagination so we don't just get a scatter of economic policies, you know, we will not give winter fuel allowance to people who earn more than whatever it was. Instead of a scatter of policies like that, a different vision of what the economy is. Because if we don't, we're always on their ground. We're always defensive. We're always, you know, just recently, the Labour Party having to demonstrate that it's tough. Which is entirely, what's wrong with that is whether you agree with it or not, the problem is that it's on their ground. It's not defining your own political terrain, and that is what we must do. And can we then, you know, integrate in a much more imaginative and richer way the economy and the reproduction of society, and really to ask that question, you know, what is an economy for? So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much, Doreen. Over to Emma.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the discussion this evening. I really just wanted to draw out a few points from Doreen's text, Vocabularies of the Economy, and hopefully say a few things that will help us to start discussing what she has said in her piece, and so we can really kind of dig into some of the issues that are there. So that's really what I'd like to do. There are 3 things I'd like to pull out. One is this issue of vocabularies of the economy. Why are we talking about vocabularies of the economy, and why are you asking us to consider vocabularies of the economy? The second thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is this relationship between the customer and the service provider, and the ways in which that is shaping how we relate to one another, and how we measure our lives and our interactions with one another, or not how we measure them, but certainly how they are being measured. Right? And the third thing I'll talk a little bit about also is perhaps this question of the hegemony of neoliberalism, and the saturation of everything with this market ideology and the practice of the buying and selling of the market, and perhaps pose a question about what sort of world-making activities are actually taking place in terms of thinking of alternatives and not simply challenging the status quo, but also taking some responsibility for bringing some kind of other society about. So those are the three things I want to talk briefly about, and I hope then we can discuss more. So first of all, this question of vocabularies of the economy. I really like how you framed that, because I think this issue of language is really interesting. You say in the piece, discourse matters.
Yeah.
And I found myself at the beginning thinking, oh, hang on a minute, but discourse matters, yes, but there is so much also about how when we don't speak to one another that's actually quite interesting and important, and that perhaps this sort of speaking truth to power, trying to critique and unpack their ideologies, their ways of framing things is also often sort of obscures what else is going on. But at the same time, I found myself thinking, well, actually language is about how we relate to one another, right? Language is about how we make sense of the world. It is, language, as we know, is a very sensual activity. And talking to one another, communicating with one another, our sense of self is bound up with language, because how we explain the world to ourselves and to one another is based on language and the words that we use to do that. So I found myself quite quickly moving away from sort of being concerned about how we might be looking too much at those in power and those making the decisions, and perhaps forgetting something else that's going on, to actually thinking about the ways in which language and vocabulary is so central to organizing and structuring the ways that we relate to one another, which is why I think sort of on this register of vocabulary it can be really helpful to start thinking about some of these issues. So language as the ways that we relate to one another, which is also a set of practices, not just a set of discourses. And this has a very important level of practice, but also a very important emotional level as well. And it's also very much about understanding and making sense of things. So I think it's very, very interesting to talk about it in these terms. And of course, not to forget, very importantly, that language is also one of the ways in which we make visible and invisible certain things that are going on in the world. And I think that's really important about some of the work that we need to do, is to uncover what's being made invisible, but also think about what might be possible. And that's again where language comes into play, right? How do we even think a different world? How do we even speak about different ways of doing things? Requires language. Right? So a very helpful framing, I think, in that sense. Your example, or the vignette that you opened the piece with about the visit to the museum, I could relate to, obviously, from the perspective of a service worker. Some of the work that I've done is on service work and is on what it means to be providing these sorts of services. So less from the perspective of the customer and what it feels like to be the customer, and more from the perspective of the other part of that interaction, namely the service worker. And there I just wanted to dwell for a moment, because I think that if we focus too much on simply the relationship of buying and selling and the market, we perhaps obscure or make invisible work. And in your piece you talk quite extensively about work and also about unpaid work. Yes. But nonetheless, I think something about also providing services and doing this sort of work is really important for us to pay attention to, because it is also here where these kinds of measures that are being imposed everywhere are disciplining our relationships with one another, not simply in a marketplace, but as people who relate to one another in ways that are striated and structured by these sorts of ratings, measures, key performance indicators, targets, customer satisfaction surveys, all of these ways in which our ways of having conversations, of doing things with one another, doing things for one another, are tallied up like washing machines, or attempted to be tallied up like washing machines. They have to become countable because they have to be valorized and they have to be financialized, as you were talking about. So measures and key performance indicators, I think there's a whole world there that we need to really get to grips with and understand how these forms of measure feed back to our subjectivities and create us as particular kinds of subjects. And I'm sure that probably the kinds of jobs that many of us do in this room will be very familiar with the ways in which the kinds of targets we have to meet shape the way that we do our work and how and what we do in our work. So it's not just about outcomes in terms of counting things up, it has a direct impact on what we do and how we do it. So I think that's really important, and it would be great maybe to talk a little bit more about that too. And the third point I wanted to talk more about was this issue of these other worlds and the hegemony of neoliberalism. And I think there is something really important going on at the moment, both in terms of people wanting to, but also having to think about different ways of doing things. And certainly in the kind of vacuum that the cuts leave behind, what we see is we have to do things differently. We have to do things for ourselves. We can't rely on the welfare state to provide things. That particular deal has been undone. I mean, it's being undone. Has been being undone for many, many years already. But certainly now is another sort of shock moment in which so much of it is being undone. And in that void is where these different world-making practices are taking place. And we can give that positive connotations because we can talk about the spaces that open up for us to reclaim this for ourselves and do it the way that we want to do it. Just as one example, the Free and Barnett Library that was occupied and then is now being run by a collective, and there are many other things I'm sure that we could think about. So we can give it a positive connotation, but at the same time, I think we have to hold on to what you quite rightly stressed in your paper, namely the vast amounts of unpaid work
That's the trouble.
that are done, and that's the trouble, right? That's the kind of contradiction, for want of a better word, that I think we're faced with, particularly lots of social movements that have been involved with trying to think about and practice alternatives do come up against this problem now of filling the void where the state retreats. And again, I think that's something that we need to talk about, and what do we do about that? And it relates to this issue of financialization. And I liked what you were talking about in terms of the language of financialization and the difference between value creation and value extraction. But I think there's a lot to tease out there still, and I hope that we can do that, because one of the terms that you use in the paper is social investment. And social investment is something that is required, right? We need more investment in communities and in social life, in society. But of course, the social investment market and philanthrocapitalism, as it's called, is one of the great benefiters of the crisis right now. It's one of the areas that is being expanded the most. Namely, in that vacuum, in that void that is left by the cuts, social investment comes in, and it's the financialized solution to austerity. Right? It's actually finding ways to attract investment from financial investors on the basis that this is a more progressive, this is a more ethical economy. But actually what it's doing is introducing that whole logic of measure and finance to these areas of our lives. Now, this isn't something that has happened simply in the last couple of years. It's been going on for longer. But again, it's something that has been increased in this moment. And I think there we perhaps need to, again, we need to develop a different term perhaps when we talk about this, or we need to really make that critique. We need to make some distinctions between when we're talking about what it is that we need in terms of resources, in terms of the way that we want community services, social services, public services to be run, how do we want to do that, how do we want to organize that, and how is a financial logic or financialization actually imposing the kinds of measures that are really problematic. So an investment requires a rate of return. How is a rate of return achieved? A rate of return is achieved through cost saving, for example, or it's achieved by financializing the sector insofar as something like a social impact bond can be traded on a social stock exchange in the same way that carbon trading functions. So I think there we've got a whole gamut of issues that we need to disentangle, because I don't think it is sufficient for us to hold out that the social terrain, the ethical terrain is something that we, as those of us who are political or who are interested in forging these kinds of alternatives, the whole history of mutual aid, of cooperatives, all of those things, that's now a new site of valorization. So I think we need some vocabularies to distinguish what's happening there. And so, in terms of vocabulary, such two words to finish that I wanted to put on the agenda. One is debt. And so, of course, the flip side of financialization is also the ever more indebtedness that so many of us are experiencing. And also social reproduction as a lens through which to look at some of these issues, so that we are not simply, say, looking at paid work, or we're not simply looking at the customer and the producer relationship, but we can also bring into view the vast amounts of unpaid labour that are being done in society, and it sort of expands our lens in really helpful ways. But it also, I think, offers us a way of thinking about what could be done, in that relating to one another in a different kind of way also is about thinking about social reproduction in a different way. Like, what kind of things do we need and do we want, and how should that work be done in a way that is different from the one that's being imposed at the moment.
Thank you.
Great, well thanks very much to both our speakers. Now we're going to open it up to the floor, so has anyone got any questions? Or comments? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jacob. Thank you for those talks, it's really interesting. I wonder though, if to develop sort of a critique of economic language, you also need sort of positive economic language, and whether to do that, you actually need to have positive economic proposals to shape your language around, you know. And I feel like, you know, in talking about this period of neoliberalism, which is about 40 years, and strangely, it's been about 40 years that it seems to me that a lot of the left has been sort of avoiding putting forward practical ideas for how you would run an economy in a different way. You know, how will you get food to 60 million people? Because that's why. Just to talk about my friends for a moment, who have, you know, maybe sort of vaguely liberal middle class people. They can't take any leftist seriously. It's because, you know, if they ask where their food's going to come from, you can't explain it. And it's, you know, what are you going to do with Tesco? These like really major practical issues. Because Tesco is where people buy their food that they take home to their kids. So if you hate Tesco, like, what are you going to do?
They don't hate food just because you hate Tesco.
Yeah, but that's where they get their food. So if you hate Tesco, it seems then you want to get rid of Tesco. So how are you going to get the food to their kids? And anyway, so but the point is, I think this is this is also a necessary part. Practical proposals are a necessary part of forming a new language. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think it's starting to be more hands, so I think we're going to take a cluster of questions at a time and then we'll respond. Okay.
I really agree with what the last guy just said, because I think if we want to throw out some of the concepts of neoliberal economics, like the concept of the expenditure investment distinction that Dorian outlined, we can't throw out all the concepts at the same time, otherwise we'll be left with nothing to speak about. So in particular, when we talk about, say, the commodification of human relationships, as the example that you gave, of this customer-provider relationship, or when we talk about market exchange, all those things will still have to happen, but in very different contexts. Whatever kind of way we organise material production, shall we say. Because in all those contexts we'll have some kind of social institution in which some people who have some things that they don't want give them to people who do want those things more than they do, and that is kind of broadly speaking what a market is. And there will also be lots of contexts in which you have duties to people which you might not just out of pure human, like animal instinct want to fulfill, like duties to your family or duties to those in your community. And that can be thought of as, in some ways, commodifying, because you're only fulfilling them insofar as you are that role, you're fulfilling a role in a certain relationship, say, to your family. You might not want to call your mum, but you kind of need to because she's your mum and that's what you really should do. In the same way that you might not really want to serve this person who's come to the cashier, but you really have to because that's your job. So I feel like instead of talking quite loosely about the commodification of human relationships and also about the properties of markets that generate exchange, we really need to pinpoint down on what elements of those things really belong in a specifically neoliberal economy and what we can retain and still continue talking about in any society in which we still need to have stuff.
Thanks. I'm going to take these two and then we'll...
I think I can relate to some of the points that have already been made, but I was very pleased to hear Doreen mention the name of Mariana Mazzucato, because she's published a very important book that reminds people of a truth which people of my generation are well aware, is that most of the inventions on which our marvellous sort of economy and private sector depend, most of the original inventions were made by state-sponsored organisations in one form or another. J.K. Galbraith's The New Industrial State is very good on this. It's a classic, well worth reading. It's better than Keynes. It tells you how things really work in the real world. And the state has played an enormous role. Practically all this stuff we have, like, you don't think some private Ayn Rand type hero in his backyard made the transistor or the computer or the jet engine. Rubbish. They were made by state-sponsored organisations. A lot of the work was done by forward-thinking people in the civil service in this country. The British had a thing called the Scientific Civil Service. They had a lot of professional people working on these things. And they invented really wide-ranging inventions. And the private sector in the US was very good at picking up on computers, like all these computer fanatics. They didn't invent it. It was invented by state-sponsored organisations. And the same in Russia, Soviet Russia, that the state organisations and design bureaus were extraordinarily effective in what they did. So they put about this lie. You've had neoliberal economists subsidised by wealthy people in the States to put around a lot of ideas that are frankly lies, that the state is useless, it doesn't do anything. And we had Miss Rand, poor old Miss Rand, who ended up on Social Security, also constructing this lie that the private sector invents stuff.
Sure.
It's
Thanks.
not so.
Okay, take one more and then we'll...
Okay, thanks. I just want to track back to the issue of language. And in thinking, during when you started, you said, how can we, or there's a need to think differently and to talk differently, so not use the terms of neoliberalism when we critique it, right? To think of a different vocabulary through which to, or to reappropriate this vocabulary. So in thinking about, for example, unpaid labor, how can we critique it? How can we reimagine it? How can we do that outside of the language of financialization and neoliberalism?
Right. There's an enormous amount here. First of all, yes, I mean, I agree with your point, and so Jacob and Hugh. This instalment was not about producing an economic policy, and we will be doing something which more closely approaches an economic policy, if we can get our act together, in a subsequent instalment. So don't hold your breath, but it will happen. But that still will be very broad. What we're about in the manifesto, I think, well, I know, is not wanting to do a lot of policies in that sense, but to think about the ideological scaffolding within which we discuss the questions. I mean, we all have to think about what we can best do in this political struggle against neoliberalism, and that's the kind of thing we can best do. And I also think it's a real priority, because I think the terrain of debate, the terms of debate have become so narrow, so constrained, so hidebound by assumptions that nobody any longer able to question, that this is a necessary step. So that's one point. Secondly, there's quite a bit of positive stuff actually in even my 4,000 words. I mean, some of it comes out of rethinking investment and expenditure, and what we call investment and what we call expenditure. And to think about this business, which comes back to you, I think, but all of us, about this somehow, and I'll come back to this at the end because I think it's incredibly difficult, integrating our understanding of the economic within a broader understanding of the social reproduction of society as a whole. And I think that's a huge challenge, but getting that on the agenda in some way. So that might come out of thinking about investment and expenditure. There's also, if we start thinking about what's the kind of model of an economy that we could produce that would have would produce less inequality, then we can look at, for instance, to the Green New Deal. I mean, which would produce loads of jobs, more equally spread around the country, both less inegalitarian and less regionally inegalitarian, less focused on London and the South East. And I would add to that, which I think it is a myth that the left has no ideas on the economy, including on economic policies. It's very difficult to get them airtime. But I mean, I belong to the New Political Economy group, and I'm sure there are quite a few other people here who do. And there's loads of stuff around. The trouble is, partly getting it airtime, partly the economic questions are quite complicated, but even more, that really to say what we want to say, you have to say, step with me for a moment onto a different planet. And let's think about things differently. So I'm not going to answer your question on, will this put up the deficit? I'm not going to answer your question on da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm going to say, let's think about this in a completely different way. And you don't get that possibility. I mean, you couldn't do that on the Today programme. You couldn't do it on Radio 5 Live. And yet that is actually what we're up against. So I guess this attempt is a way of broaching that, of trying to step onto another planet and see if we can find terms with which to discuss it, and awkward questions that they can't answer within their terms. Do you see what I mean? So I absolutely accept what you say at one level, but I think we have the resources, and the more we do it, the more we talk about what we already have, the better it will be. I think one final thing on this is, I'm sure a lot of this is known within the more formal political sphere. But what we want is people, even when they come out with a policy as opposed to a bigger political vision, is to relate that to a broader framework. At the moment it seems like a load of scattergun stuff that comes out, with not embedded within any other framework for the ways in which we think about economy and society. So it's making that link between the practical policies, which I totally agree we need, and they're awesome around, but they look really odd if you're not standing on this other planet. So it's building those bridges, I think, that is really vitally important work, which is absolutely not to take your question seriously. I wasn't talking about throwing out terms so much as so investment expenditure I want to disrupt and rethink. Speculation I want to put on the agenda. I want to say that's what you're doing, mate. You're not producing wealth.
No.
You're speculating. But then finally, just to come back to this thing about seeing the economic as part of the reproduction of society, one of the people I talked to during writing this is trying to think about what would an economy look like if we put care at the centre of it. Care for people, care for the planet. It would look astonishingly different somehow. I mean, one little model, which is not one I advise you ever to use on the Today programme or any other outlet, is Cuba, of course. You get hammered if you use it, but actually they have put health and education at the centre of the economy, perforce in many ways, because they have to. But it does look very different from the kind of priorities we implicitly work with here, which is short-term profit. But I think a question like unpaid labour, and we talked about this, and it absolutely epitomises this, because there's a whole section I didn't mention about unpaid work, and the GLC in the 80s economic strategy started with unpaid labour, domestic labour, biggest section of the London economy, it said. Absolutely essential to keep the city going, but I don't think we were saying let's pay for it. I think it's about recognition of, because I'm not in the payment for housework argument. It's more about recognition and integration together of all these things that it takes to reproduce a society. Market relations, mutual relations, and unpaid relations, relations of love and affect and all those things, but to recognise them all. That we need all of that to reproduce a society. At the moment, you think the only thing we needed was market exchange. But I do think it's very tricky, because we don't want suddenly to think, we say there's a lot of unpaid labour, and they say, right, let's marginalise it all. I mean, that's the last thing that we'd want to happen. So,
thank you very much. To pick up on that last point about unpaid labour and making unpaid labour visible, and actually trying to marketise it, I think there is another kind of avenue, right?
Yes.
Because you mentioned the wages for housework campaigns, which were campaigns in the 1970s up to the 1980s that were demanding wages for housework. And importantly, not for women housewives doing the work, but for housework in general, to make visible the work as work, but also to make the point that that capital depends on vast amounts of unpaid labour, and that actually not all of that work could be paid for, and to demand a wage for that is perhaps a conversation that is still relevant in terms not of marketising those relationships, but of having a basic income of some.
yes,
of
if you
some
put in those terms.
That's
right.
right. Yeah. So perhaps there's a distinction that we could make between the marketisation as a response to a demand for wages, or for making this work visible as work, and some kind of basic income that would be based on care and a principle of care, that everybody should have the right and the possibility to a life and a quality of life, and to have their basic needs met. So perhaps there is a conversation to be had around that, and I think that's about the question of unpaid labour and thinking about it. I think for me there is something that we haven't quite resolved also around work, paid and unpaid, and that you quite rightly make this point in your papers, that we are doing a hell of a lot of paid work as well, and that actually stress is increasing, working hours are increasing, the kinds of communication technologies that we have developed mean that we are permanently on, we can do the kinds of jobs that a lot of us do require the iPhone and all the rest of it, and our kind of work and non-work time has also blurred, and we are doing an incredible amount of work, and then that has a vocabulary also of doing the kinds of jobs that satisfy us in some way, that are, we get to realize ourselves, we get to do the kinds of things that we want to be doing. So again, that blurs the kinds of boundary between what is work and what is us trying to do something meaningful in the world, right? And there, I think, is a whole gamut of conversations to be had about what constitutes work and what constitutes some other kind of activity, and the ways in which our lives are organized around work as this activity. So I think a different language is required. That's why I like the term social reproduction, because it makes all of these activities visible, but can perhaps offer a critique in a way that doesn't mean we fall back onto the idea that everything is work and everything should be work, right? I think that's an important issue. And then just perhaps to pick up again on this notion of unpaid work and what to do about it, and this question of communities. Perhaps one of the issues that we might want to raise is that we do these things on our own terms, that it's not, the question is on whose terms do we do work in the community, on whose terms are various social projects organized. And if we can have that question, then perhaps that also opens up a space in which it's not about paid or unpaid or wages or higher wages or lower wages or benefits or whatever, but actually on whose terms and how are we going to do this. And I think that also brings quite acutely to the forefront the political question that's at stake, and who decides how these things are done.
Okay, let's take some more questions. So this one first, and then okay.
I just wanted to say that I'm very concerned about the false logic of empowerment that's inherent in the current vocabulary, and also the speed of change of the vocabulary. Just from an example, care was mentioned as well. I worked as a carer for 4 to 5 years, and the speed of change of what you were. I started as a carer, next year I was a support worker, then I was an enabler, and ended as a service provider for clients. And you also find the similar sort of logic in the university environment, where people say that, like heads of departments, managers say that we are more independent now from the government, we can do what we want, we have more research money. And the students themselves who pay like 9,000 a year, they say, oh yeah, and when I say as a tutor that's unethical for me to teach people pay 9,000, they say, oh well, but isn't it like a more valuable thing now? And I find that very disturbing. And I think while there have been some attempts to sort of disturb this logic of false empowerment, I think there could be more done in that area. But again, the speed of the counter change is always also very disturbing, how it's being reappropriated.
Thanks.
I was picking up on something that Anna said about this idea of philanthrocapitalism, which I have never heard of, and it's, I think, very intriguing. And it has a lot to do not only with those aspects, but also how for the past, I think, 30 years, this country has been managing services, so that the trends were privatization and also the idea of voluntarism as kind of the only way forward. But one of the words that is related to that I would like to kind of put on the table is the word collective. Which for me is very important, because first of all we know that the first major blow to of neoliberalism was in attacking collective labor demand.
Yes.
And I think that one of the fragility of all the left today is the inability to create a collective demand.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about, we always think about politics as providing answers, but I think I've always thought about politics as being able to reframe questions and to try to ask different questions. And therefore, I'm not interested to answer of where food comes from. Why are we asking these questions? Why? We are asking because it's so expensive, and we work all day and then go to the supermarket and bring dinner home, and then we start all over again the day after. And but this idea of collective demand is also very interesting, because I think it's very diverse across countries. And I'm thinking about the fact that, for instance, in the UK, it's impossible to create a collective demand about housing. And I'm involved in a few cases where, housing estates and council housing has been under attack. But I don't belong to that, and I feel I can't belong to that fight properly, because I belong to a fight where I want to be the gentrifier, and I am the gentrifier. Unfortunately, I am the gentrifier. But the collective demand is that my mortgage is a value accumulation, it's a redistribution of value, the same value that is the land that is being reused. That is the collective demand. But it's difficult, it's terribly difficult, because if you don't have a roof upon your head, it's very difficult to argue about collective demand about us. And where I come from in Italy, it's labour market, where everybody is one against the other on the labour market. So those who are employed by the public sector, private sector, self-employed, everybody's got a different pension scheme to do it, and everybody hates each other, and everybody has a different tax regime. And so I think the issue is about, how do we organise collective demand? On which level do we organise collective demand? And I want to ask about, and unions have a major role to play about. Maybe they have been doing some damage to that. I won't talk about work. I have lots of things to say about work and unpaid work, especially academic and intellectual unpaid work. But I won't go into that. So.
Thanks. Okay, I'm just going to take two more quickly.
Okay, I want to, we're expanding ever outwards, but I want to expand a little bit more actually, and that's to talk about spatial language, to talk about the spatial language of neoliberalism. I'm a landscape architect, so I belong to a profession that has traditionally shaped public spaces, public parks, public squares, these kinds of things. And interestingly, the term public realm is now being applied to all types of landscapes, including private landscapes. So you can talk now without seeming hypocritical or two-faced about the public realm of Canary Wharf, for example, which is absolutely private. And also that the term public realm, because it can also be sort of shifted off to the side to discuss, just green leafy things. So I saw an architect from Grimshaw's talking about the new development of the train station at London Bridge. And he talked about the roof and all the halls and the spaces and the retail areas. And then he talked about the public realm. What was he talking about in a train station? He was talking about a little strip of trees along the street. So there's some sinister language of neoliberalism that's at work there. And I'll try to keep this brief. The thing that unpacks off of that is all of the events in Istanbul and Turkey at the moment. Because what we're seeing is explicitly the language of neoliberal public space coming to dominate. And it's not just Gezi Park, but it's also the 5,000 proposed hydroelectric facilities along the coast of Black Sea and such. So there's an explicit link between ideological and spatial tyranny in Turkey that's being played out in space. Fascinating.
Thanks. Mike.
Because I'm Mike Rushton, I'm one of the manifesto editors. I just want to say that I think there are some things that can be done with a debate about vocabularies, and there are some things that can't. And I think we've heard very well about what can be done, because we do understand the way that this whole discourse and way of thinking penetrates everyday life in many institutions. But I think there are some things that it doesn't do so well, which is to understand the nature of the structures. And I don't think understanding the nature of the structures is the same as deciding on policies to try to do something about the structures, although ultimately one would want to see that happen. And I think that question of structure even applies in regard to the question of markets. Because the system talks about markets all the time, we think, right, we live in a market system and we must basically criticise and attack the market system. But actually we don't live in a market system. We live in a system which is dominated by giant monopolistic corporations, which basically substantially control governments, and which make their profits mainly by rent seeking, by rigging the markets that they operate in, and by persuading government to help them rig them, which we see all the time. I mean, there's just lots of illustrations one could give. There's very nice piece by Aditya Chakrabarti in The Guardian the day or two ago talking about Branson.
Yeah.
Flamboyant entrepreneur, flamboyant businessman. Aditya points out that most of Branson's businesses have basically found niches given to him by the state,
Yes.
Virgin Rail,
Absolutely.
slots at Heathrow, you name it, in which a
The NHS.
safe rent can be captured.
NHS,
Safe
yeah.
rent capture can take place.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, Dorian and I are both patrons, or at least she more than I, of a little market that exists at the end of our road, not very far from
Oh,
Kilburn.
that one, yeah.
Right? most people like markets when they find them. Farmers' markets are very popular institutions, including with radical people.
Overpriced.
But that's because they meet the criteria of markets. That's to say, roughly equal people with reasonable information, free access, no enormous powers dominating what happens. You could almost say a bit more market and a bit less market wouldn't be such a bad thing. Take higher education. This is being made into a market ideologically, so we all have to do all the things that we do with our students and consumers. But anything less like a free market than the higher education system or the school system could barely be imagined. Think of the school system. Parents as consumers, etc., etc. But you have a dictator, basically a Stalinist system, regulated by Ofsted and managed by Gove, changing the curriculum at will, organising the structures at will, bullying parents to take what they don't necessarily want. What kind of a market is that?
Yeah.
Or take the higher education system. Why is it that most degree courses in this country are more or less identical, roughly speaking? Because they're policed and organised in the same way, according to a prestige and established structure of how long a term is supposed to be, etc., how much fees people are supposed to pay. There's a very complicated arrangement between government and the providers of university education, which make entry into the higher education system, i.e. you or I deciding to start a university and providing classes from which people could get degrees, impossible. It can't be done. Because the system is actually organised as a state-regulated structure with a certain kind of corporation, now called a university, functioning to all intents and purposes like any other kind of corporation, with its enormously high wages and so on for its salaries for its people, which is an example not of the marketisation of the national life, but of the corporatisation of the national life. Now, these are questions of structures, so I just think we have to think about the structures and what bits of the structure we're in favour of and what bits of it we're against, and not find ourselves in attacking the mentalities that this system produces from believing that the mentalities that it produces necessarily describe the world as it actually is. Indeed, part of the function of the mentalities is to disguise the world as it actually is, and to pretend to the so-called democracy of markets, when actually that is not the game at all. The game is for people to gain wealth by means which enable them to subvert markets, even to subvert the normal rules of a market economy, like people should pay their taxes, but we know that most corporations and most banks don't. How can you have a market economy with rules when most of the powerful players in the system don't obey the rules? So should we be attacking the markets, or should we be attacking the falsity in which this is presented as where we are? Now, I think this is an ongoing discussion that we're having in the manifesto, and I do think, obviously, the vocabularies debate is a fundamental point in this discussion, but I also think we need another kind of debate, or a different debate, about the kind of structures we have and the kind of structures that need to be opposed, and about where the unpopularity of these structures, which is quite real in many of the cases I've described, can be, as it were, mobilised.
Michael, can I say one thing? I obviously agree with those things we've talked about, but what you said about markets and corporatism is, in fact, the term market is actually used to cover. It is about our language as well as about the structures, and you said very clearly that it's covering over the reality of the actual structures. So we need both at the same time. It's also the case that markets would produce similar courses, I'm afraid. But anyway, that's by the by.
Do you want to carry on?
Well, do you want to
I
start?
think you have more.
No, we're going to take another round.
Okay. Where to start? It's always difficult when lots of comments and questions, you end up picking out one thing and not another. It's always the way. But I guess one of the things that's really obviously kind of pulsating through the room and is not being spoken about yet is power, right? And what power, what our power is, where does power lie, and what power do we have to change? You talked about empowerment and this question of the way in which neoliberalism co-opts certain notions or perhaps takes them on board and turns them on their heads, so that actually a lot of the time when empowerment is being talked about, it doesn't really feel very much like empowerment, or perhaps there's a particular kind of empowerment. But certainly this question of power, where does our power lie to challenge, to contest, and to do things differently, and how can the practices that we need to develop actually gain any traction and any power to affect change? And I think there is here also a very important question around what's happening in the context of austerity, and that what sorts of practices and alternatives are generalizable. So how can we get away also from a very privileged world in which some people have the resources to have their free schools or their nursery schools that are run in a more collective way or whatever. People can do that and other people can't. So the question of how we can make these sorts of alternative practices more general and where our power lies, I think is really important, because we can also challenge a lot of things, but who are we? How do we do that? Who is going to listen? And obviously the question of collective demands is not only a question of collective demands, but also a question of how do we get to a sort of collective sense when obviously so much of the neoliberal ideology, as we well know, is about creating this notion of isolated individuals that have nothing to do with one another and so our interdependence, our dependence on one another is really important to highlight. And so I think what is important about some of this, some of the ways in which the market, as we've been talking about it, reigns as a production of a particular kind of subjectivity, is also about imposing forms of social control, right? And that links back to power, and that we don't try and do things in another way. We can't, because we don't have a sense of what it is that we could do. We don't have the resources to do so. So then, of course, we have the question of the state and what to do about that. And I think it's really interesting that in a lot of the protests in the last few years, there hasn't actually been, I mean, you were criticising the inability to formulate a collective demand, but actually, so people turning to one another as opposed to trying to articulate demands that need to be met is an attempt at creating some kind of collective power, such that I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, I was trying to remember where I read this in the last few days. It was an article that was talking about people finding their voice, but not a voice with which to speak to power, but actually to be able to hear one another. And I think there's a shift there that is useful and helpful to contemplate, but it doesn't necessarily resolve all of our problems, and we still perhaps want to have a discussion about the state.
Yes, just a few things. I don't know what we do about this denigration and collapse of the sense of collective. I mean, there's been some active undermining, as in the destruction of the trades unions, to a large, well, not destruction, but the attack on trades unions and the prioritisation of the competitive individuals you were talking about. And I don't think we can simply reclaim. We want to reclaim the term, but rethink what it means. I think there are different forms of collective now which are emerging, and I'm not at all sure about how I would even think about collective now. But something of that ilk is absolutely for sure needed and quite difficult to construct. On false empowerment, I mean, yes. And one of the most dispiriting things, I suppose, is that irony of the neoliberal age in which our power is as consumers. We can choose. We can choose between n million kinds of loo paper. But when it comes to the big choice, like what kind of society do we want, or what kind of future do we want to build, we're told there is no alternative. So choice stops here. As soon as it starts getting important, There is no choice. And I mean, that kind of, the disempowerment that rhetoric has led to has been amazing. Spatial language. I mean, I've spent my life yakkering on about space, so and the public space issue has been a big one for the Occupy movement, Indignados, so forth, and the privatisation of public space in the urban realm and all of that stuff. And what I would just say is that there has been a tendency, even on the left, to equate public with simply not private as well, and that's kind of not good enough either. And nor is it good enough to do the kind of Richard Rogers, let's create a plaza, you know, and then everybody can walk across it and maybe bump into each other occasionally. That's not public space either. For me, public space is well, the kind of the toughest definition, the most demanding definition of public space would be a kind of space where the public can be, in a sense, constructed, where we can learn to become citizens within the public. And in a sense what that's about is the creation of spaces for democratic contest, democratic discussion. And that relates back to the collective thing and what a collective means. Because, I mean, the very fact that a lot of these meetings are going on at the moment, and most of them are very well attended. I mean, our launch was massively overbooked. There's been a number of, I think there is a thirst for talking to each other about stuff, and there are not the old places to do it in the way in which there were. So for me, that would be the creation of, this is, in that sense, for me, part of, you know, an element in the creation of a public space. It is a little public space, even though we, in very broad terms, agree with each other. We're not exactly encountering the antagonistic voice. But it's about, it is about making democratic discussion part of the texture of society. I think, having real public spaces and thinking about how we might do that seems to be phenomenally important. There's all kinds of spaces in that sense. So yes.
Okay, I think we'll take a couple of quick final points or questions to conclude. You first.
As well as thinking about vocabularies and structures, I think that one of the ways of dealing with some of the questions that's been raised is to think about mechanisms. So the market is a mechanism, and the market is one mechanism for getting collective outcomes. It's a mechanism specifically designed to get collective outcomes without us having to make any decisions. And you can make choices. You don't make decisions. So it's mechanical, it's automatic, it's without debate. Now, there are other mechanisms, you know, and if we think about the universities, for instance, there's a misconception, and sometimes I have to point this out to my students, that it's a misconception that they are customers. Because you can't buy the grade. You will be judged on merit, and the merit will be determined by academics discussing your work and coming up with an agreement based on discussion. All right? So that's not a market mechanism. The mechanism for determining your grade is not a market mechanism, it's a discursive mechanism. And it's a mechanism about assessing the merits of something. Now, assessing the merits of something goes completely against markets. All right? If you're assessing the merits of something, then you're not saying whether it's good value. You're saying what its value is regardless of what its price is. All right? So, in fact, neoliberal economists do not assess each other's work according to market mechanisms. Neoliberal economists assess each other's work according to the merits of the arguments given. They do not subscribe to a market mechanism for determining the value of neoliberal economic writing. All right? So let's start looking at the mechanisms that we use and the mechanisms perhaps that we want to use for determining the collective outcome of things.
Yes.
You know, which takes me back to the point about the destruction of the welfare state and the idea that we might look at the positive side of the destruction of the welfare state. Well, I think that what we should also do is remind ourselves of why it was positive that we had a welfare state in the first place. In other words, that if you have universal free provision that is based on need, not on ability or willingness to pay, then you have a non-market mechanism for providing certain services. And so let's think about these other mechanisms that we can use to allocate resources collectively. That we might allocate resources according to merit, and we might allocate resources according to need, and we might allocate resources because we've decided to get together and talk about what we're going to do with the resources.
Thanks. George.
I've been thinking, trying to hoik my head round about the intellectual history of the epistemological heart of neoliberalism, and it struck me that we seem to have forgotten to just think about the time frame, to think about 1922 stuff around Mises socialism, to think about Lippmann in 1928, to think about Hayek in 1944, to think about the Montpellier Society, that thought collective in 1947, to think about, if you like, the defeat of Barry Goldwater, to think about Allende being overthrown by Pinochet, or indeed to think about the arrival of Thatcher and Reagan, and to think about the way in which, unlike us, we tend to think of Marx as this way, as the place we think from. These people think from a number of places, and they don't say the same thing. They don't occupy the same regime. They do produce and embed a common sense. That's why it's important for us to pay attention to vocabularies. That's why sometimes it's important to learn from the Atlantic Enlightenment, that other encounter. It is seriously important for us to get out of the usual habits and think from somewhere else. And I think neoliberalism probably knows better about sociology of knowledge than we care to admit.
Thanks. And
oh yes, okay. Mine is Philip. The last speaker and the one before have kind of provided a kind of hook, because we started off talking about vocabulary and structures, but actually it's not vocabulary versus structures.
No.
It's discourses which reflect the structures. So if you think about where the ideas which we now call neoliberalism, and they become this basic common sense that it's very difficult to even kind of think in any different way, where they come from. They don't just come from nowhere, they come from powerful corporations and powerful individuals who are very much advantaged by having us all thinking in a certain way. And I was thinking while I was coming here, that basically, as a positive idea, neoliberalism has very much had its day with the crisis and so on that we see. I think if you were to ask the average person in the street, how great do you think it is that the state should kind of wither away, and that there will be, sorry, that's not a very good expression. There should be less provided collectively and more provided for the benefit of the banks and large profitable companies. You wouldn't get a particularly positive answer, but nevertheless that isn't going to mean that neoliberalism is just going to disappear, because there's too much ensconced in it. A number of people have talked about collectivity of action, and I mean another very prominent discourse in the last 20 or 30 years has been individualism and how great that is. And even if people don't actually much like the idea of individualism, they nevertheless, the television replaces cinema, private activities replaced public activities, and so on. A lot of what is called the public realm is actually private realm with a little bit of space put into it, and so on. So that we're kind of ensconced in this individualism, and it's actually very difficult. So where do we go now? I mean, the traditional organisation to the left, particularly the Labour Party and things around it, are not, it seems to me, an appropriate way forward. But what is happening? There seems to be, from the number of people in this room, the number of people in similar discussions, there seems to be a large willingness for this kind of thing to happen. But what is going to happen? We need to kind of reshape reshape the discussion. One of the things we need to reshape it against is this individualism, not only in language but also in practice.
Thanks. And one at the back.
Yeah, thanks. Joe, it's really, really interesting to hear what everyone's saying, and I wholeheartedly agree with a massive amount of it. One of the things that I've kind of been thinking about is, whilst I completely agree with this disrupting and rethinking of language in these particular economic terms, it also kind of feels like that if the left is ever going to kind of retake ideology in this way, that actually we also need quite a lot of new language, because socialism now is such a taboo. It's like it's been so successfully demonized by the rise of neoliberalism. The same with the names of people like Marx. They've been so successfully made to be this this kind of absolute evil that actually it needs some new language, completely new terms, if we're ever going to kind of formalise this in any way that's going to provide a meaningful challenge to that. That's something I'm kind of interested in. I wonder if you thought about this or talked about this at all.
Thanks.
Well, I agree with that, and it's a hell of a task. And in the sense that the new language too kind of only comes out of practice, I think, or will only. You can't just make it up. I think that's why I think something like pre-distribution is so unsatisfactory. It's kind of technically correct, but it doesn't embody a way of being in quite the same way, the way we might want. But yes, we do need to think about that. And there were odds and ends in the Green New Deal, weren't there, of kind of little catchphrases and such. But I do agree with that. I'm not going to reply to everything, because most of it was thoughts and comments. Mechanisms, yes. I mean, one thing to do is indeed to point out just how much of, it's not just unpaid labour, but just how much of what makes the world go round is nothing to do with market relations at all. In fact, one extremely errant, you talked about broadening the debate, well here's a broadening. One errant thought that occurred to me while we were discussing unpaid labour was, where would we be without the work the bees do?
Yes.
Unpaid, unthought about, desperately in need of rescuing from these unpronounceable pesticides. I can't remember Thank you. Then, something else outside the capitalist system, but absolutely necessary, not just to capitalism, but to us, to everything, and a battle being fought over it. Anyway, so
that's ecosystem services.
Ecosystem services.
Yes, that's how it's
And you
phrased
can
in
put a
government
value
reports.
you can price that.
You can trade it.
But do they
You can
get
trade
paid?
They get valued.
The point is, this debate could go a long way. Ecosystem services, will that do from you? And just finally, I mean, to relate to actually both of your points, I mean, obviously, there is a bit about competitive individualism in the paper, but I think it is important. We joked at the launch about, I'm the youngest of the three writers of the manifesto, so we're pretty ancient, and one of the advantages is we can remember when this wasn't common sense, when times were different. But also, I think we're very committed to that longer temporal framework that you mentioned, and if you haven't read it, please do try and read through the framing statement, because there we're trying to see this particular incarnation of neoliberalism in this particular place in a broader context, both temporally, kind of a couple of centuries of history, and also globally. Because, I mean, one of the things we barely touched on, but we will very much in subsequent discussions, is the appalling role the UK plays within the global economic and ecosystem. So we need to set it in that context too. I'll finish there.
I don't really want to say very much else. Perhaps just to make the point about the global, or to reiterate the point about the global. It's obviously the perspective that we need to have on this is a global perspective, and they're also understanding that we're still faced with a system called capitalism that still relies on particular kinds of social contradictions and class divisions, and that these are global, and that actually thinking about what divides us and what keeps us apart from one another in a global context is a really important thing to consider. What to say.
Great.
Okay, well, should we continue in the pub? Does that sound like a plan? Perhaps the one over the road, Ben?
Got one
Looking
over
you.
the